This is So Life Wants You Dead, a show that explores the intersection of illness, disability, healing, and creativity. I had an emergency organ transplant in 2015, and despite the drama of the situation, it turned out that near death was fertile ground for my creative life. Now, all these years later, I can say that was what saved me. That and a brand new liver. I'm Nora Logan, and this is a podcast on how looking at death helps you live. Today, my guest is Daisy Friedman. Daisy is a writer and director based in New York City. She's also a multi-organ transplant recipient. And as such, her work centers mostly on the intersections of tradition, intimacy, embodiment, and disability. Her most recent short film, Unholy, just had its world premiere at Sundance 2025, which is such a thrill because we discussed it on the show, which we recorded a few months ago. Her work has been featured in Deadline, Variety, Advocate, and Out magazine, and screened at prestigious film festivals such as Frameline, Inside Out, and Outfest. On today's episode, we talk about so many things, but mostly the complexities of chronic illness, societal perceptions of disabled bodies, and the empowerment found in creative expression. We also talk about the process of filming Unholy and how Daisy has found her voice through filmmaking and poetry. Here's the conversation. Welcome to So Life Wants You Dead, Daisy. It's so good to have you here today. I'm so happy you could join us.
Thanks for having me. I'm super excited.
So you're a writer and a director, and you're also a multi-organ transplant recipient. And I wondered if we could start with you telling us a bit about your background and your story.
So I was born in New York City. My family is from New York, multiple generations back. And I was born with a gastrointestinal disorder called gastroschisis, where your intestines develop outside your body and your abdominal wall doesn't fully develop. So I had surgery for that right when I was born. And from that time forward, I had a bunch of different surgeries for things I don't really know about what they were. But it ended in something called short gut syndrome, which is where the majority of your intestines get damaged or have to be removed. So I was put on a feeding tube at a very, very young age and didn't eat. And that turned into needing a central line and something called TPN, which is total parenteral nutrition, which is where you get a central line placed and you get fed through your heart in a liquid form. And that formula for TPN was really, really new at the time. And I was at Columbia Presbyterian, I believe. Don't quote me on that. And it ended up killing my liver because I was so young and my liver was so small. And it had fish oil in it at the time, which was not the move for liver, healing food. So it ended up killing my liver, and the doctors there sort of were in denial about it. And they said, no, you're fine. And my parents were like, I don't think so. So how
old were you?
I was 2.5 when that happened.
Okay.
And my family was researching the best gastrointestinal rehabilitation programs in the country. And the one that came up at the time in 2005, 2006, was the UNMC, University of Nebraska Medical Center in Omaha, Nebraska. So my family got on a plane, went to Omaha. I was only supposed to be there for about a month just to get a treatment plan so that they could kind of set me straight and then go back home. And they literally took one look at me and said, no, you need to move here. You need to live here. You need to have a transplant. And so my mom, or I guess my dad, called my grandparents and literally asked them to sell our apartment. And then I grew up in Omaha. In 2006, I had a small bowel liver pancreas transplant. And then a year after that, I had post-transplant lymphoma, which is something that can sometimes occur when your immune system is very, very anked after a transplant. And yeah, that's sort of my younger life. And then I kind of grew up in Nebraska, really wanting to be super normal. Nebraska is not the best place to be anything but that all the time. And so I really pushed away from a lot of the illness, disability, transplant-oriented things. I kind of got forced into going to transplant reunions and stuff, which was a very weird vibe looking back. It's sort of just a lot of posturing for donate life and like sticking sick kids in front of a camera with like really inspirational music. And it's just like the vibes are super strange.
Yeah.
And so I really sort of felt like it wasn't something that was really mine to explore or to think about. It was something that both simultaneously like happened in the past, but was still very present, but in a way that felt very disconnected from my body and my being. And I kind of just lived like that for a while. And then I went to college at 18. I went to UCLA, and then came to New York, and yeah.
Yeah, thank you for sharing all of that. We've talked together personally about your story, and it's really interesting to speak to you and just to be in an ongoing conversation with you, because I came to having my transplant when I was so much older, and your perspective is different because you were so little, and I imagine didn't even really understand what was happening at first. And then growing up with it and coming to terms with whether you want to even claim the word disability or how you view your body, and you've been through so many iterations of it over the years from what you've shared with me personally.
Yeah.
And I'm curious about how it felt making the transition also from being a teenager in Nebraska to then going to LA. And I know you've made some work and written some different pieces and poems about that experience, and then now being in New York. What has that been like for you?
Yeah, I mean, it's been a huge change, a huge transition. I mean, I sort of spent a lot of my younger life like pushing away from that, like I said, and also like always hearing, oh, you don't remember it. Oh, that's so good. And I think it is good in a sense, but I think it's really bad in another sense, because I think then like I have these scars, I have these things that I still have to deal with on the day to day. And like, I don't know where that comes from. I don't know, and I don't have the opportunity to ask the questions all the time. And I recently did when I went back to Nebraska, which we've also talked about. But like, there's just things that happen, and I just kind of take it in stride and say, okay, this is probably part of this, but okay. And I think it felt really difficult to see a path forward in my life when I didn't know how and where I came from in a lot of ways, and how I got to this point, other than like my parents helped save my life, which is beautiful and also challenging, like also doesn't give me enough agency, even though I was young, but still dealing with sort of like the emotional repercussions, and like ownership was kind of the first thing. And I was not going to do that on my own. But when I went to UCLA, it was during COVID still. And I am immunocompromised. I take medication for that to be so, immunosuppressants. And in January of 2022, the Omicron variant of COVID was super, super high. And the chancellor of UCLA put out a statement basically that said, if you're too medically vulnerable to come to class, you should take a leave of absence. And I sort of found myself in this gray area, which I usually find myself in, of being like, well, I could go to class, but it's not great. This isn't an ideal situation. If I get sick, I'll be maybe fine, or also maybe not. And just like living in this really precarious sort of in between of like sickness and health, which is a really interesting, complicated place to be, I think. And there was this protest that the Disabled Student Union was putting on, and I saw it on social media, and I was really interested and really impressed by it, but sort of was like, I'm going to be impressed from afar. I'm going to keep up on social media. I will donate $5 if they want me to donate $5 or whatever. And then they said that they were occupying the admin building overnight. So they marched from the middle of campus to the admin building, and they just kind of decided to stay, and no one really told them they couldn't. And so I went for an hour, and I really don't know what possessed me to, because it was nothing that I would have done before that. And then I went the next day, and then I went the next day. And by the third or fourth day, I bought an air mattress from Target and was sleeping on the floor. And like, it literally changed my whole life, because I think I saw these people in this community, in this like really powerful disabled community, that were very alive. And I think my experience of disability up until that point and other people were that they were very not alive, that they were very sick and very much sort of their lives were taken over by their illness, by their parents especially. And that was my association with disability. I didn't know that it was possible to be disabled and to be powerful, or to be disabled and to be a force of good in your community, or like political change. And I think that was instrumental. And I think I saw a lot of myself in them, even though our stories, most of them, all of them, were very, very different. No one had a transplant. Most of them had a physical disability in some sort of way. But I just felt so deeply connected to them in a way that I couldn't really explain, but felt so pure and rich and beautiful. And I'd written a film during COVID to get me into UCLA that at the time was called Come As You Are, about an interabled queer couple who spend the night together for the first time. And I was 17 when I wrote that, just bored and sad one day in my room. And when I wrote
Bored and sad.
Bored and sad, a COVID memo.
Exactly. That's COVID in a nutshell.
No, literally. No, but yeah. And I looked at it afterwards, when I was 17, and I was like, oh, this is just a silly little work of fiction. Wow, that's so interesting. Cool. And then I kind of put it away. And then after the sit-in, I knew I was going to be moving to New York because I didn't like Los Angeles. I didn't like UCLA. I think one thing I thought was so interesting about Los Angeles and UCLA was even though I had grown up in this kind of homogenous place, I had never been stared at more than in Los Angeles. When I wore whatever crop tops, when I showed my scars, I had never been perceived so much in my life, which was something that I don't think mentally I could have handled being there. That's not the only reason I left, but it definitely wasn't a small part.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then I reached out to a small production company in Queens originally for an internship when I moved to New York, and they said they didn't have any projects slated for that summer, so I asked them if I could pitch them a project, and I think at the time they were like, what? Yeah, I guess pitch us a project. You're 12. And I sent the head of the company the script, and she liked it, and she said, if you guys can get, or if you, just me, can get a pitch deck, some storyboards, and treatment together in a month, we'll talk. And I didn't know what that meant, any of those words. So I asked my friends, I asked my professors, they really helped me. And I made the whole package, I pitched it, and she said, great, if you can get the money together, let's make a movie. So I did a GoFundMe, people really supported it, and we got this thing off the ground. And I think that sort of started the next part of the journey of really meeting more incredible disabled people that were artists and models and so talented and so beautiful and had progressed sort of already in their lives. One of my actors is a bit older than me, and seeing the things that she had done just fueled this fire to keep going, and that this part of me that I was so disinterested in exploring was the thing that has been my fire, sort of, and something that I found so beautiful and vulnerable and still very difficult, but it's taken on this whole new thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it sounds like this experience of being part of the sit-in where you didn't really even expect anything clicked you into not only a new understanding about disability and how alive that community is, and also recognizing yourself as part of the ecosystem and igniting a fire of creativity within you, and then getting something made and getting funding for it, which is not an easy feat.
No.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it all feels a little bit like a fever dream. Since then, I mean, I think since COVID, but that's a international, everyone says that. But if I could split my life into a before and after, it would be the sit-in. 100%. Yeah.
So we'll share a link to this really beautiful short film that you shared with me in the show notes. And your work really centers on these intersections of tradition, intimacy, embodiment, and disability. And just hearing your story explains in a way why you're driven to make work like this. But I'm curious about the consciousness around these themes. How conscious are you when you're writing something that you want to weave these different themes of embodiment, of disability, of tradition? I'm especially curious in the word tradition as it relates to your work. And I know you're working on new ideas and new things all the time. So maybe even just speaking to what you're working on right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think in the beginning, I wasn't conscious of it. Like I said, I sort of wrote this when I was in high school. It was very kind of haphazard almost. But I think now that I know that it's in there, like I think there's just a well that like there's just more and more and more that comes out. And the more I think about it, the more other things I think about, and the more other things I think about, then that like has a tangential theme to another thing. And I think it's now this like whole ecosystem. And I feel like my mind is almost playing catch up with my body in a certain way of like, I didn't really have all of these years to really process this thing. And I'm doing it now, and I get to do it in my own way now, which is really exciting. And one of the films I'm working on now, we just finished post-production, submitting it to festivals, is about a girl who goes to her family's Passover Seder for the first time since being put on a feeding tube for chronic illness, specifically short bowel syndrome, which is what I had. And it sort of, to me, has been this reimagining of like what my life would have been if this was more prevalent during this point in my life, but also reflecting on what it is and what it has been and my family relationships and how my family has calibrated around this situation and always has, and how if it was sort of more severe, how they would, and kind of just drawing attention to the like apparent connection between food and love in Judaism, but in culture in general and in tradition, and sort of like what you miss out on when you not only can't have that in terms of food, but also can't have that in terms of whatever your accessibility needs are, and how rigid tradition actually is. That's why it's traditional. And I think not seeing myself in a lot of those stories growing up with scars, with very complex medical history, and wanting to sort of give other people and give my younger self like things to latch onto. And like, if I'm thinking about it, so is someone else, I hope. And if they're not, maybe they can start. And yeah, I think also a part of it's like been kind of an unconscious like community building practice for myself, because like, I think we've talked about this too, like there aren't that many of us. They're just not. They're not here.
Yeah.
And I think making things that are somewhat connected, even though I haven't made a transplant story yet, but like somewhat connected tangentially, I think has been a way to just get closer and closer and closer to like the thing, to the community and to the people that I did and still do like need to be around to kind of like fuel that part of myself.
So you shared your short film Unholy with me, and I got to watch it before it's shared with the world, which I was so grateful for. And it really encapsulates so well what you were just speaking to, because it doesn't focus on transplant, like you said, but I found myself relating so hard to the main character, and it really encapsulates the humor and the heartbreak that can come up when you're sick, and also dealing with family. And she enters into this very, very precious to the Jewish community, the Seder dinner. And I'm not Jewish myself, but I related so deeply to the grandmother character. I don't want to give too much away, but people not necessarily understanding why she can't eat, and just people not knowing necessarily how to act. And also the painful reality when you're at a Seder, specifically where the food is so delicious and people have spent so many hours and poured so much love into the food that's on offer, and not being able to partake and having to also explain oneself. There's just so much in it. It's a 15-minute film, but there were moments where I was really laughing, and then I was also crying. And I love that type of work. And there's a moment with Noah, the protagonist's cousin, where her cousin says, "Congrats on being alive." And I laughed out loud. So I'm just curious, in the process of writing it and then directing it and working with the actors on it, how it was for you, because it is a really personal story. And what was it like as the viewer myself, I was going through a lot of different emotions just watching it. It really touched me. And I can only imagine what it was like for you working on it.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for saying all those things. That's so sweet. It was really beautiful. It was really cathartic. I mean, a lot of the lines from the family are direct quotes that people have said to me, like the congrats on being alive. Someone said that to me last year at a film event after telling her my story.
I love it.
Which is hilarious and
so
ridiculous.
funny.
And like,
So
why
funny.
would you say that to a person?
Yeah.
But then you get to, that's the beauty of being an artist. Then you get to put it in a short film and hopefully she doesn't see it, or hopefully if she does, she forgets. But yeah, it was a really beautiful, challenging thing. And I knew that I had to get it right. There's a shot in the film that has a medical device in it. I'm not going to say what or anything, but that was really challenging because we tried so hard to get an actress who used a feeding tube, but there aren't any. And if there are, they're really sick. And the problem with set and the problem with accessibility right now is, as until we start making this change in the industry, is that it's very difficult to calibrate around an sick actor.
Yeah.
And so we tried and we tried and we tried, and it didn't work. And I was going to cast my friend who is currently going through a similar situation, but she ended up hospitalized the week before. And we were like, we kind of knew that that was coming a few months in advance. So we said, no, that's not going to work. And my friend was going to be a body double for this one shot because she had this specific device. And then she ended up being hospitalized. And so we couldn't do it. And it was either what I thought was we either put the tube on the actor who has never had this experience, or we cut the shot. And I wasn't okay with either. So I did it. So there's a shot in this film and the person that you see is me. And that was really challenging. That was one of the hardest things I think I've done as a director, because I put it right where that specific thing used to be on my body. And it looked, because of our phenomenal makeup team, it looked so real. And I had never seen that in my conscious memory. And so it was this really strange somatic experience, and it felt very comfortable, which was strange. Like it wasn't scary like I thought it was going to be. It felt very familiar, which there was no reason. I mean, there was a reason for it to feel familiar, but I wasn't really expecting that. But it was, I don't know, it was really beautiful to sort of see a lot of these situations play out that not only had been in my head because I was writing it, but also had been in my head for years before that. There's a scene in the kitchen, I won't give it away, where the grandma kind of maybe isn't the most appropriate or says the most appropriate things.
As grandmas sometimes do.
As grandmas sometimes do. Yeah. And that whole interaction is a direct quote from my grandparents every single time we go out to eat for the last 17 years. Literally every single time. It's ridiculous, but it's hilarious. And I think this is what art is about, is being cathartic. And it didn't really feel like a therapy thing for me, which was really good, because I don't love when art is that.
I agree.
I think because the actors were so phenomenal, I think it was really almost like a deepening process, seeing this thing that sort of has been my story. I mean, has been my story, but not exactly, not biographically.
Yeah, the actors that you cast are just phenomenal. I'm very excited for people to see it when it comes out.
I'm very excited.
Yeah, it's extremely relatable, and I don't see very much like it out there. So it's a really important piece that I hope lots of people get to watch.
And I think that's the thing too with As You Are, and also with this, and also with my work, that I haven't intended to do, but I've gotten a lot of feedback of wow, I've never seen anything like this. And I think to me that's almost shocking, because it's in my head so much. And I think about this stuff all the time. And I share it with my friends and I share it with my family. And it's sort of our world. I mean, people in the disabled community, people not, but anyone who chooses to surround themselves with me, kind of is privy to this. So when I get that feedback that it's so out of the ordinary, it kind of takes me aback in a way that is a little upsetting, but also I'm very happy about. I'm so grateful I can contribute that to the world and to art, but also kind of sad that someone else hasn't done it before me.
Yeah, absolutely. And I recently, as I've shared with you, I've written a feature, and we recently did a live reading of it, and having people say, like, hearing our lines back that we intended to be funny land, and sometimes our jokes didn't land, and it's like, okay, well, why not? And watching this film of yours, the tone of the humor and what you're doing with how real it is, because being alive is sometimes really sickly funny, and being sick is the same thing. And sometimes it's really heartbreaking and painful.
Yeah.
And that is my experience of illness. It's that there were really hilarious moments and continue to be. And because that's just also part of being alive. And then there are very painful moments. And I think you strike that balance really well. And that's what I strive for. And I think that's why we need to tell our stories and also not make them into a therapy piece, as you say.
Totally. And like, I think so much illness media is so sad and so like pitying. And I know like in the worlds that we go in, like, of course it is. But like, I think a lot of people don't even acknowledge or like are able to clock how like either painfully sad or like inspirational things are supposed to be. And I think finding the balance between the two is like actually the only way to do it, because it's just living, like you're saying. Yeah.
It's really funny. You're reminding me, this just happened this week, but I hired someone to make me some reels for this podcast. And it's a new person. And I generally don't put music to the reels. And out of their own volition, they picked out, I meant to send them timestamps of the snippets that I wanted, which was my bad that I didn't do that. But in the first edit that they sent me, they had attached the most depressing music to a part of the interview with this person that was also like one of the most graphic parts of the interview that wasn't actually that interesting, and it was just remarkable to me. There's nothing, they didn't really do anything wrong because I didn't give them enough direction, but it was remarkable to me that they would choose to find the saddest music. And that just speaks to how we view as a culture disability and medical stories, when it just isn't really the case.
Totally. I mean, even in medical settings, every single time I walk into a doctor's office, I get some iteration of like, wow, that's crazy. It's like, dude, your one responsibility is to not do the thing that you just did. Yeah. Like, that's the only thing you're not supposed to do, is make me feel like this is horrible as a physician. And I like, if they're not trained, that means no one is trained, which is just so absurd. And like, I think there's so many kind of blind spots in our culture, for lack of better terms. But this is such a big one. Like, I think we have a lot of room to grow in a lot of instances, but I think illness and disability are still not things that people are even thinking about. Like, it's on people's radar. Like, I'm a film studies student, and I watch these films. A lot of them are older. Some of them are not as old, but the jokes that they have in them that our professor won't even acknowledge as bad, like, is shocking, and no one is going to bring it up. And usually I do end up bringing it up, but it's so surprising how long things like that have gone on and are continuing to go on until people like you and I are like stopping it in its tracks.
Yeah. Like, hey, what's up? And you have this line that I don't want to give too much away about your film Unholy, but Noah, the main character, says at one point, nobody knows how to be around me. And I think that's what we're kind of circling around is that people don't know how to be with and sit with illness. And it's at this really pivotal point in the film, and also relates to the wonderful title of the film, of like how when the world is looking at you a certain way and doesn't know how to be with illness. And I really think from the many, many, many hours of contemplation that I've done around illness, it faces people with their own mortality and their own potential illness. And so it's sometimes not even conscious that they don't know how to be with it. And I wonder, in the crafting of that story, when you came to write that, were you kind of thinking about how people are with you as you wrote that? Or is that something that you've even maybe said to a loved one? I guess my question is like, how intentional was it that you're making a commentary on this thing that we deal with?
Very intentional.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that the doctor's office thing I just mentioned, that's a big one. I think, and we've talked about this like personally, I think people don't know how to calibrate their brains around especially transplant. I mean, I think all illness, all disability, I think a lot of also chronic illnesses that are maybe not as researched or understood. But I think the thing about transplant that's so interesting is like from what people learn, it's like you're sick and then you have a transplant and you're good. And I think in a lot of instances, with maybe less like obtrusive ones, I think maybe that is the case. I don't want to speak on it. I don't know. But I think in a lot of instances, it's not the case. And I think people don't know what to do with me as someone who looks very healthy and in a lot of ways is, and in some ways is not. And I think like speaking about like this like gray area thing that I was talking about earlier, I think it's really hard for people to understand how to categorize me. It's really hard for me to understand how to categorize me. I don't know. I wake up some days and feel very confident in claiming disability, and some days I don't. That's a challenge. But I think by doing the work I've been doing, I've been making people more comfortable with me and making people feel like they can be around me. And I don't think it's a conscious thing in most people in my life, but I think also for younger people, like I am in my really early 20s, and I think most people have not had such profound illnesses and profound experiences with almost dying. And I think, yeah, like you said, I think that's something that's really, really scary for people. And I think people either, this also relates to something in the film, but like make it a huge deal or never speak about it. And I think I've also found that a lot in like my interpersonal relationships and like romantic relationships. It's like you can never really strike a balance between acknowledging it in a normal way. Like it's really hard for people to be normal about this, which is so ridiculous because like we're walking around every day trying our best to be normal about it. Yeah.
And I really relate to that. Some days I wake up and I'm like, you know what? This isn't a disability. I'm absolutely fine. Why am I writing so much about it? And why do I have a podcast called So Life Wants You Dead? You know, like I really do feel like that. And then other days it's like, well, actually, I carry this with me every day. And there's actually a poem that you wrote that really, really spoke to me about this very thing that we'll get into a little bit later. But that's why it's so important, I think, to make the work that you're making and to speak up about it, because of this really, I think, detrimental thing that we're told you're good, because it discredits, as transplant recipients, we're told, okay, you have this surgery and then you're good, off you go, because you are good, you are alive. Off you go, great. But it comes at a cost. And there are things that one has to deal with on a day-to-day basis that doesn't necessarily get talked about. Maybe there isn't space. The medical industry maybe doesn't have resources to support you with. And in speaking up and making work and especially in making fully formed pieces like Unholy, you can reach more people.
Totally. And I think like something that I hear all the time when I explain my story is like, wow, that's terrible, but you're good now, right? And it's like, wait.
Oh my God, people love saying, but you're good now, right?
Yeah, it's like, what? Like, no? Yes? I don't know what you're looking at. Like, sometimes.
Are you good now?
Are you? No, literally. The congrats on being alive, I was talking to my friend and I should have said afterwards, yeah, you too.
You always think of the comebacks in any situation. For me, I always think of the comebacks like 3 days later. I'm like, oh, shit, I should have said that.
And I think the thing that I've come to realize in my situation, like there's 30 intestinal transplants done a year still-ish. I don't know if that's about 30, approximately 30. that's nothing. That's literally nothing. And I was in an interview with my old nurse coordinator for another project I was doing. And she kind of said for the first time, like, you know, everyone who had a transplant, pretty much everyone who had a transplant around the time you did is either dead or has never eaten again. And I was like, okay.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, I was like, okay, cool. I'm going to remember that forever and I'm going to keep it here. And I think because of that, there aren't resources because I think they expect that everyone's dead, which is crazy.
Yeah.
Like I had to ask at like an appointment of mine, like, oh, so do you think I might need another transplant in 20 or 30 years? And the guy was just like, maybe. I was like, what do you mean maybe? And he was like, we just don't have the research. And I think that's fair. That's a very normal medical thing to say to someone.
Of course.
But like, yeah, I think there's so little we know about so much of the like illness space in general, whether it be transplant, whether it be something else, that it's really hard to help people in a medical sense, let alone in a personal, like, okay, well then, so what does that mean? How do you go on living a life? Like, how do you plan a life for yourself then? And I think that's something I'm thinking about. I'm about to graduate college. I don't think anything is going to happen, but maybe it will. I don't know. And I think there's so little resources, but also representation of sort of this middle ground of like, I don't know.
Yeah. And outside of even a therapeutic setting in having psychological support, like the community aspect is really lacking.
Totally.
Beyond, honestly, a Facebook group. There's more than that. I don't mean to be glib about it, but it does feel lacking.
I mean, I don't mean there's more than that. There's not. Like, there's definitely not. I mean,
very few. There's sometimes there's support groups organized by the hospital,
totally.
but it's not. In my experience, there are never very many young people there.
Totally. And like, if they are, they're like 2 years out, 5 years out. Yeah. Okay, what happens after that? I don't know. Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's the thing that like has also I've realized in more recent years pushed me to do all this is in response to having no community. Because A, maybe I will get some, and B, maybe other people will. And that's the dream. And I did a documentary about a girl or multiple girls with complex stomach issues in Omaha. They're currently there now. And like that was sort of the closest I've gotten to community because they were all on TPN, or they are all on TPN, which is weird and trippy. But like that's still not it. Like I love them dearly, but that's still not it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's going to be like a lifelong process of like, where is everyone? There's actually a really beautiful documentary that I haven't seen. I really want to, called Is There Anybody Out There?
Mm-hmm.
I think, were you telling me about it? Okay, it's this disabled woman who has a very, very rare condition who kind of asks this question throughout this film of like, is there anyone else like me? And I haven't seen it. It's been on my list. It was at all the disability film festivals this past year. It was beautiful, apparently, but like I've been thinking about that, and I think also for young people, TikTok, let's say, is a huge resource.
Yes,
I've tried. I've looked at TikTok. No one is healthy on TikTok, on transplant TikTok, which is also a little disheartening. But I think also it's allowed me to kind of inadvertently be a model for people, and I don't think I asked for that, but I'm okay with it. Like if it's going to be someone, I'd like it to be me.
Yeah, of course. And generally, when you become a role model in any sense, you're not necessarily asking for it, but it's sort of what life asks of you.
Yeah.
And it's so interesting to hear what you've been searching for and the community that you're looking for, because that's really why I started So Life Wants You Dead. And in this kind of initial quest for community and finding other people with similar stories. And that's why I love doing it so much, because there is this thread, no matter what the condition is. Of course, you and I have a lot to relate on because we're both transplant recipients, but I speak to so many different people and there's always a commonality. And that's also just the human experience, you know? And you mentioned something earlier about living in LA and feeling like you were stared at, or not feeling like you were stared at. And I wondered if you would read this really beautiful poem that you've written called Ode to the Stares and the Stared At.
Ode to the stares and the stared at. Did you see that person gaping at you? And I'd answer, what person? Eli Clare. A feeling of being watched, but only for a moment. Look, then look away, not too long. Your eyes travel up and down or across, whatever way follows the path of abnormality. Not trained in the art of looking at our bodies, you gawk at the very fact that we are present. Crossing the street, on the train, in the deli, we're forced to wear our stories on our flesh. More of a body than a being, we belong more to you than to ourselves. We let you take in our broken parts, our scars. We let you drink in our limps, our bent limbs, because it is easier to let our eyes avert your gaze than to acknowledge that we do not have the privilege of anonymity. We are your oddity, your personal circus, your reason to be grateful today. Our first perceptions of ourselves are in your image, seeped into our bones, becoming the marrow. Frankenstein, invalid, freak, you corrupt our worthiness. Before our lovers can take us into their arms, make us believe that they want us, all of us, we look away, pretend that we didn't see the way that you taught us to.
Thank you for reading that. Listening to that poem, I just am struck by what we were just talking about in regards to community and looking for people to connect with. When I first read it, even just the word Frankenstein, that's something that I felt myself about myself in years ago in when I was really sick, and also just kind of carrying myself through the world and dealing with maybe not even someone physically staring at me, but the reflections that come back from people and feeling like an oddity. And I think about how much disabled people, especially when someone has a visible disability, how much disabled people carry, and the views, the judgments, and this oftentimes unspoken language that people can speak with a simple look. I'm wondering how you carry that today, because you obviously think about it so much, and how you interface with how you carry yourself through the world with your scars and with your body as it is.
Yeah, I mean, that poem came from a specific experience. I've been running a fair amount just for fun, and I was running in Riverside Park, and I almost caused a bike accident because a guy was on a bike and was riding and saw me and started like veering his handlebars into like my direction, because that's what happens. But almost hit a car, and I was just like shocked. I was like, really? Because like I think it's this really interesting thing, because I know a lot of disabled people at this point, and this is kind of a dangerous game to play, but in comparison, not that I like to do that, my body looks very whatever normal is. I have scars that look slightly more abnormal because I had to get restitched after my transplant, and there's kind of a lot of them, but it shouldn't be that big of a deal. But it constantly over and over becomes this big deal. And in writing that poem, I took my experience into account, took my friends' experiences into account, and the Frankenstein line, I've been called that on Hinge. And
really?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. And even just yesterday, someone responded to me and was like, looks like someone almost killed you, LOL. What? That's crazy. That's crazy.
Same.
That's crazy. And and then was like, oh, good shit. And I was like, well, okay. And I think it's interesting because I experience, I don't know. I think my body image is very weird and fucked up, because I think the things I experience in the world are that of someone that has a very different body than I think I do. And I think that disconnect is really strange. And also the disconnect of I get to choose when I subject myself to this. And if I subject myself to this, that means that I am being true to myself. But if I don't, and I keep myself a little more sane, then I'm hiding, then I feel like I'm hiding some part of me. And I think that's a really weird mind fuck a little bit. And I think it's a process. I think it's a challenge. And I think everyone, especially in like the dating world, I think every time I get that, it's not a common occurrence, but it's not an uncommon occurrence. It's just a little like places you like one ring down on the self-esteem chart. Because also I spend so much of my life now trying to be empowered in this experience and be kind of like embodied. And I think it's actually really hard. And I think there's a disconnect between the work one does or the work we do and the actual somatic experiences we feel. And I think my dad is amazing. My dad's a therapist, and he always is like, yeah, the lifelong goal is to intertwine those two and to kind of integrate those. And I'm like, you're so right, but how? But how? But I think it's true. And I think being disconnected from your body is a survival mechanism, and it's something that I employ maybe more often than I should. And I think in situations like this, but then beautiful art comes out. So that's hard because like, I do not think all art should be derived from suffering, but also it makes good art sometimes. Yeah.
Yeah, and that disconnect is necessary sometimes for survival. And also, it's funny because sometimes I feel I too have this kind of disconnect of like, I think I know that I'm hot, right? Like I walk around and being like, oh, I'm really hot. Like, great, cool.
As you should.
And also there were moments a few years ago on Hinge where I kind of like said something about having had a transplant, and then having people respond in a similar way to what you experienced. No one ever said Frankenstein, but very similar kind of vibe. And kind of being faced with that difference. And also the truth of who I am and how I feel about my body. And it's just a strange thing to kind of have to be in a relationship with. And because you just mentioned embodiment, I wanted to ask you about another poem that you wrote that's we'll also put in the show notes. It's called On the 8th Floor of Mount Sinai. And you have a line that, as an organ recipient myself, I identified with so much. And it goes, our quiet was interrupted by a nurse coming in to administer her evening meds. First, though, she had to flush her line. I closed my eyes, visualizing each step by sound and smell alone. Sanitize the cap. Insert the syringe. Unclamp the line. Push the saline. And as I read that, I remember that feeling so viscerally, and it's been a while since I've had to have my line flushed. And it made me think about the somatic experience of reading and writing poetry, and in digesting art in general, what it evokes in us as the viewer or the reader. And when you're writing poetry, how much of your body do you bring into it? In the like specific act itself?
I think a lot. I mean, I think with that, like you were reading it, I could like smell it.
The smell. I just loved the smell.
Oh, that's crazy. That's insane. That is insane. I can't handle it. Yeah, I don't know. I think a lot. That poem, one of my very close friends who was also involved in a project I was working on, was hospitalized for like months, and I was visiting her, and the poem is about going and visiting her and sort of kind of selfishly kind of trying to heal myself in the process and trying to get back this sort of image of what that was when I can't remember certain parts. And then you go in and then you have this experience where you're like, oh, I remember that. So I think you have to bring your body into it. I think there's no choice not to, even if it's hard. And I think there's a lot of things that you can elect to not bring your body into, which I love to do. It's my favorite thing. But I think writing, I think if you're going to make good work and make truthful work, you have to, no matter how painful that is. I think also that's something that I talk about a lot with my other friends who have had similar situations. I mean, not that similar, but like I have a group of friends who I interviewed for this film who have very complex chronic illnesses. And it's sort of like this kind of beauty and vulnerability and pain in having to be faced with this over and over, whether it be in writing, whether it be in the medical space, whether it be both, whether it be if you're in academia, but like getting to sort of approach it in some ways on your own terms. And I think that's another thing that I, through my writing and through my film, I've really tried to do, because for so many years, this has been other people's experiences, whether it be my parents or my physicians or my organ donor, which is, now we can't get into that, but whatever it may be, it wasn't mine. And neither is or was my body, I think, in a lot of ways. And I think my work, I can kind of do that and put myself back in the narrative, so to speak, when I actually get to write it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you'll have to come back and we can talk about the death of it all. So we're gonna close out, and we have 3 questions that we always ask our guests. If you lived in a world that completely catered to your disability, what would that look like?
I mean, I think an actual like access needs way, just like a lot of bathrooms would be nice. New York City public bathrooms would be the dream.
Mm-hmm. That's a good one.
Yeah.
What's one thing you do to keep yourself creative each day?
I try to write a little bit almost every day, or like take a picture or do something kind of creative. I have a lot of journals and a lot of notes apps with like half-baked thoughts. I notes app the shit out of my day. I usually try to write at least one thing, one phrase.
What's one phrase or saying that you always come back to?
There is a phrase in Hebrew that's l'chaim, which means to life. And I have it tattooed on me.
Beautiful.
And I think just like continuing to live large and live like radically, in spite of everything. And in Judaism, it's a celebratory statement. So l'chaim.
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 Thank you so much for being here with us today, Daisy. It's such a pleasure to have you, and you'll have to come back. I'm really looking forward to seeing all the work you continue to do.
All right. Thank you so much.
That was our show, So Life Wants You Dead. Our illustrations are by Renee Fagan. If you like what you hear, please subscribe, leave us a review, rate us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can find us on Instagram at So Life Wants You Dead, where you can follow along for updates about the show. Thanks so much, and see you next time.